Imagine you are holding a map of the ancient world. You see Rome, you see Greece, you see Egypt, and somewhere in the back of your mind, you probably feel like you know those places. You have heard the stories, you have seen the movies, you have read the names. But now, I want you to take that map and I want you to look at West Africa, right there in that vast stretch of land below the Sahara Desert. Because at the very same time that some of the most famous empires in history were rising and falling, there was something else happening in that part of the world, something extraordinary, something almost no one today talks about. There was an empire there, a real empire, with gold, with armies, with kings so wealthy that foreign merchants traveled for months just to reach their borders. Traders came from thousands of miles away. Entire economies depended on the goods flowing through this empire's land. And here's the question I want you to sit with right now. Why have most Americans never heard of it? Not because it was small, not because it was weak, but because the story of how history gets told is itself a story worth knowing. What I'm about to share with you has been passed down through generations, not in books, not in libraries, but in voices, in memory, in the quiet knowledge of people who never forgot, even when the rest of the world did. This is the story of Wagadu. Some historians call it the Ghana Empire, but its people, they called it Wagadu. And by the time we get to the end of this video, I think you are going to feel something you did not expect to feel. Not just curiosity, not just surprise, but maybe a little anger. Because the more you learn about this civilization, the harder it becomes to understand why it was left out of the history most of us were taught. Let us start from the beginning. Long before the first European ship ever touched the coast of West Africa, the land south of the Sahara Desert was already alive with trade, with movement, with power. The Sahara Desert is one of the largest and most forbidding places on Earth. Most people imagine it as a barrier, a wall of sand that separated civilizations from one another. But that's not how the people of ancient West Africa saw it. To them, the desert was a highway. Camel caravans moved across those sands, carrying gold, salt, ivory, and cloth. And right there, at the crossroads of those trade routes, where the desert met the fertile land to the south, Wagadu was born. Now let me paint you a picture, because I do not want you to think of this as a list of facts. I want you to feel what it was like to be there. Imagine a city rising out of the earth, mud brick buildings stretching toward the sky, markets full of noise and color, merchants haggling in a dozen different languages, and at the center of it all, a king. A ruler so powerful that his title was not just a name, it was a force of nature. The king of Wagadu was called the Ghana, not a place name, a title, a word that meant warrior king. When foreign traders heard the word Ghana, they didn't think of geography, they thought of authority, they thought of gold. And the gold. Let's talk about the gold, because if you want to understand Wagadu, you have to understand what gold meant to the ancient world. Gold was not just money, it was power, it was diplomacy, it was the language that every civilization on Earth understood. And Wagadu sat on top of some of the richest gold-producing land in the known world. To the north of Wagadu lay the Mediterranean world, Egypt, North Africa, eventually the Arab world and beyond, and all of those places needed gold. To the south of Wagadu were the gold fields, deep in the earth, producing enormous amounts of the most precious metal in the ancient world. And Wagadu sat right in the middle. Now think about what that means for a moment. If you controlled the middle, you controlled everything. Every ounce of gold that moved from the south to the north had to pass through Wagadu's territory. And the kings of Wagadu knew exactly what they had. They did not give that gold away. They taxed it. Every caravan that entered their land paid a tax. Every merchant who moved through their borders paid a toll. Salt coming in from the north was taxed. Gold going out to the north was taxed. Historians and archaeologists studying this period believe the empire generated enormous wealth from these taxes alone, not from conquest, not from theft, from trade, from the intelligent control of commerce. Here's a question worth thinking about. Have you ever heard of a civilization being described as wealthy not because of war, but because of trade? Because Wagadu was exactly that, and that is not how most people imagine ancient African kingdoms. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to know what you think. Let me introduce you to one description of the Ghana king that comes to us through historical records. Around the year 1068, a North African scholar named al-Bakri wrote about the court of the Ghana king. His account was detailed, vivid, and the image he described was breathtaking. The king held audiences in a pavilion. Around him stood 10 horses dressed in gold cloth. Behind him stood 10 pages holding shields and gold-hilted swords. To his right were the sons of lesser kings, all of them wearing beautiful garments, with their hair woven with gold. At the door of the pavilion stood dogs of an admirable breed. They wore collars of gold and silver. This was not a modest kingdom. This was not a small operation tucked away in some forgotten corner of the world. This was a civilization displaying wealth and power on a level that stunned educated visitors from some of the most sophisticated cities of the ancient world. And yet, most people today would struggle to place it on a map. Why is that? Why do some civilizations get remembered while others seem to vanish entirely? I want you to think about that question, because your answer might reveal more about how we learn history than it does about Wagadu itself. Now, the empire did not appear overnight. Wagadu developed gradually over centuries. Most historians and archaeologists place its founding somewhere in the 4th or 5th century. It reached the height of its power roughly between the 8th and 11th centuries. That means this empire existed and thrived for hundreds of years. Think about that for a moment. Hundreds of years of stability, of trade, of culture, of growth. Rome, at its height, lasted roughly 5 centuries before beginning its long decline, and Rome is one of the most studied civilizations in human history. It appears in movies, in books, in architecture, in law, in language. Wagadu lasted for a comparable stretch of time. In its own region, it was no less powerful, no less sophisticated, no less influential. So what happened to the story? Part of the answer lies in something that is easy to overlook: how a civilization chooses to record its history. In Western Europe and in many parts of Asia, the dominant method of keeping records was writing. Clay tablets, papyrus, manuscripts, stone inscriptions. When a civilization falls and its buildings crumble and its people scatter, the written records often survive. They end up in museums, in archives, in translation. But in much of West Africa, the tradition was different. History was not stored in books, it was stored in people. There was a special class of historians, keepers of memory. They were called griots. The word griot may be unfamiliar to you, but the concept is extraordinary. A griot was trained from childhood to memorize history. Not just dates and kings, but stories, relationships, lineages, the full, living texture of a people's past. They could recite generations of history in a single sitting. They carried entire civilizations inside their minds. And when a king died, the griot who knew his story was said to be more valuable than any monument, because monuments crumble, but memory, properly passed down, can last for centuries. What do you think is more valuable, a written record that can be copied and shared, or a living memory carried by someone who truly understands the meaning of what happened? Leave that thought in the comments. I am genuinely curious what you believe. The griots of West Africa preserved the stories of Wagadu, and those stories survived. But here is the problem. When outside historians, many of them European scholars in the 18th and 19th centuries, began studying African civilizations, they often did not recognize oral history as legitimate history. If there was no written record, some of them concluded there was no real history. That assumption was wrong, deeply wrong, but it shaped what got included in textbooks, what got taught in schools, what got passed down to generations of students, and to their children, and to their children.
What many history books rarely mention is that the absence of written records does not mean the absence of civilization. It means the absence of a certain type of record. Archaeology has since confirmed much of what the oral traditions described. Excavations in West Africa have uncovered evidence of sophisticated cities, of advanced metallurgy, of long-distance trade networks connecting Wagadu to the Mediterranean, to the Arab world, and to parts of Europe. The civilization was real, the power was real, the gold was real. The gap was in how the story was told and who was doing the telling. Let us go back to the Golden Age, because I want you to feel the weight of what was lost. At its peak, Wagadu controlled a territory covering what is now parts of southeastern Mauritania, western Mali, and parts of Senegal. The capital, believed to be located near present-day Koumbi Saleh in modern Mauritania, was reportedly one of the largest cities in the world at the time. Think about that. One of the largest cities in the world, in West Africa, in the 10th century. Merchants from North Africa arrived in caravans. Arab traders came seeking gold and reported back to their own scholars about what they saw. Those Arab accounts are some of the most important historical documents we have about Wagadu today. And what they described was a sophisticated, organized, multicultural commercial hub. Different religions coexisted. Different languages were spoken. The king maintained a balance between traditional African spiritual beliefs and the growing influence of Islam that was spreading through the trade networks. There was tolerance. There was pragmatism. There was something resembling what we might today call a diverse and open society. That probably surprises some people, because the image many people carry of ancient Africa does not include that kind of complexity, but the evidence suggests it was exactly that complex. The trade itself is worth describing more carefully, because it was not just gold. Salt was almost as valuable as gold in the ancient world. It preserved food. It was essential to survival. And the salt mines of the Sahara were an enormous source of wealth for the traders who controlled the northern routes. Wagadu sat between the gold fields of the south and the salt sources of the north. Slabs of salt moving south would be exchanged for gold moving north, and Wagadu took its share of every transaction. There were also copper goods, iron tools, textiles, ivory from the forests to the south. This was a fully functioning economy. Diverse, interconnected, resilient. At one point, historians estimate that much of the gold circulating in the medieval Mediterranean world passed through Wagadu at some point in its journey. Here is a question I want to leave with you for a moment. If an empire controlled a significant portion of the gold supply that powered the economies of the Mediterranean world, including early Islamic states and parts of Europe, should that empire be considered a central player in world history? Think about that, and then think about whether you ever learned about it in school. If you did, tell me in the comments, because most people I talked to did not. But no empire lasts forever, and Wagadu's decline is itself a story of complexity, of multiple pressures building over time. It did not fall in a single dramatic moment. It unraveled, slowly, over generations. One of the most significant pressures came from outside. Around the middle of the 11th century, a movement known as the Almoravids began expanding southward from what is now Morocco. The Almoravids were a powerful Berber Muslim reform movement. They were motivated by both religious ideology and territorial ambition. Historical accounts suggest that Almoravid forces clashed with Wagadu around 1076. Some historians believe they captured the capital. Others argue the conflict was less decisive than traditional accounts suggest, and that the damage was more gradual. This is an area where historians still debate, and that debate itself is fascinating because it tells us that even what we do know about Wagadu is still being studied, still being questioned, still being refined. But the military pressure from the north was real, and it disrupted the trade networks that were the lifeblood of the empire. Then there was the land itself. The Sahel region, the semi-arid belt just below the Sahara, is an environmentally fragile zone. Rainfall patterns shift,
Droughts occur, vegetation disappears, and when that happens, the carrying capacity of the land collapses. There is some evidence that the region around Wagadu's heartland experienced significant environmental stress over the course of the 11th and 12th centuries. Some researchers point to deforestation caused by the large population and the demand for charcoal to smelt iron. Others point to shifting rainfall patterns. Whatever the specific causes, the land around the empire seems to have become less productive over time. And a great trading empire needs food, it needs water, it needs stability in the natural world around it. When the land suffers, the people suffer. And when the people suffer, the taxes stop flowing, the caravans slow down, the power begins to drain away. And then there were the internal divisions. An empire that spans a large territory and contains many different ethnic groups and traditions is always vulnerable to fracture from within. The Ghana kings maintained their authority through a combination of military power, religious tolerance, and economic benefit. But as the empire weakened, as the trade routes began to shift, as military pressure from the north continued, the peripheral regions began to assert their independence. Smaller kingdoms that had once been part of or dependent on Wagadu began to break away. Local power centers emerged. The coherent network of trade and authority that had defined the empire for centuries began to fragment. This is what the end of great empires often looks like. Not a single dramatic fall, but a slow unraveling, a gradual loss of coherence, until one day there is no longer an empire, only the memory of one. How does something that powerful simply disappear? The honest answer is that it did not disappear completely. It transformed, it scattered, its people survived and adapted and built new things, but the specific structure, the specific identity known as Wagadu faded from the center of history. And here is where the story becomes something more than just history, because the disappearance of Wagadu from mainstream historical consciousness was not purely a matter of natural fading. It was also a matter of how history came to be written and taught. When European powers began systematically colonizing Africa in the 18th and 19th centuries, there was a powerful ideological motivation to portray Africa as a continent without significant history, without great civilizations, without complex political structures, because that framing made colonialism easier to justify. What is often overlooked in discussions of colonial history is how thoroughly this framing reshaped what got taught, what got published, and what got remembered. The archives of oral African tradition were not considered serious historical sources. African scholars were not given platforms in the major universities and journals that shaped Western knowledge. And so the story of Wagadu, along with the stories of many other sophisticated African civilizations, got left out, not because the evidence was absent, but because the people doing the telling were working within a system that was not designed to include it. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a well-documented historical process that many serious scholars, both African and Western, have written about extensively over the last several decades. And now, because of the work of those scholars, things are beginning to change. Archaeological work in West Africa has accelerated. Sites connected to Wagadu and the wider cultural sphere of ancient West African civilization are being excavated and studied with modern tools. New translations of Arab historical texts are providing richer pictures of what the empire looked like through the eyes of contemporaries. And perhaps most powerfully, the oral traditions preserved by griots are now being taken seriously as historical sources, recorded, studied, cross-referenced with archaeological and written evidence. A fuller picture is emerging, and what that picture shows is an empire that deserves to be known, fully, without apology, as one of the great political and commercial achievements of the ancient world.
So where does that leave us today? I want to ask you something directly. If you went to school in the United States, how much time did your history classes spend on African civilizations? Not Egypt, Not ancient Egypt, which everyone learns about, but West Africa, Central Africa, the kingdoms south of the Sahara, the civilizations that were built, flourished, and fell across a continent containing more than 50 countries and thousands of years of complex history. For most Americans, the honest answer is very little, or none at all. And that is not a personal failure. It is a reflection of what the curriculum was built to include and what it was built to leave out. But you are here now, and that matters. Wagadu was not a myth. It was not a legend passed down to inspire people or to give them a false sense of pride. It was a real place with real buildings, real markets, real families, real kings who made difficult decisions about how to hold an empire together, real merchants who traveled dangerous roads to bring goods to its markets, real griots who sat with their students and said, "Remember this, do not let this disappear." Those griots knew something important. They knew that memory is fragile. They knew that without effort, without intention, without commitment, history disappears. And they made the choice to be the keepers of that memory. So the question I want to leave you with is not just about Wagadu. It is about everything that Wagadu represents. If one empire this powerful, this wealthy, this culturally rich can almost vanish from human memory, how many others have fully vanished? How many civilizations rose and fell across this earth that we will never know about, not because they were not worth knowing, not because they did not matter, but because no one was positioned to preserve their story in a way that the dominant historical tradition could recognize? That question should sit with you for a while, because it is not just a question about Africa. It is a question about the nature of history itself, about who gets to tell the story, about which voices are recorded and which are lost to silence. Wagadu fell, and then it was forgotten by most of the world. But here is what did not fall: the gold, the rivers, the land. The descendants of the people who built that empire still walk that earth today. They carry that history in their blood, even if they cannot always name it. And the griots, the tradition of the griots, never fully died. In parts of West Africa today, griots still exist, still practice their craft, still memorize lineages and stories that stretch back further than most written histories in Europe. The memory survived, imperfectly, partially, through incredible effort, and now that memory is beginning to reach a wider audience, including right here, including you watching this video right now. I started this story by asking you to take a map and look at West Africa. Now I want to ask you to do something with what you have heard, not just to watch, not just to nod and move on, but to hold the question, what else has been left out? What other stories, from Africa, from Asia, from the indigenous civilizations of the Americas, from ordinary people who built extraordinary things, what other stories were recorded somewhere outside the mainstream and are just now beginning to be heard? That is not a comfortable question, but the most important questions rarely are. Wagadu was erased from mainstream history, but it was never truly gone. It was waiting, in the voices of griots, in the ruins beneath the Saharan sand, in the accounts of Arab travelers who saw something extraordinary and wrote it down, in the gold that still flows through the veins of West African culture today. And now it is here, in this conversation between you and a story that refused to be forgotten. If you think the world deserves to know about civilizations like Wagadu, share this video with someone who loves history, someone who might be surprised, someone who is ready to have their picture of the ancient world expanded. Because the real story of human civilization is far larger, far richer, and far more complex than any single textbook ever suggested. And we are just getting started.